In the world of international diplomacy, there are few more recognizable figures than Kofi Annan. In a long and sometimes controversial career at the United Nations, he played a part in some of the most significant issues in recent history. Now he spends his time as a mediator in global problems and an advocate for issues close to his heart, like global poverty, the environment and food security. Recently, he came to Singapore to lecture at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Singapore University and also to take the chance to talk to Al Jazeera. First of all, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Happy to be here.
Let me ask you about comments you've been making in Singapore this week. Yes. Part of your focus, not only here but generally, is food security. And you've spoken here about how you think Asia has a role to play in Africa in assuring food security and alleviating hunger. But for most people who listen to the media, Asia's role in Africa in this context seems to be confined only to China buying African farmland to feed its own people. Is there a relationship here that can be developed beyond that?
Asia has very useful lessons for Africa. For example, about 40 to 50% of agriculture here is irrigated. In Africa, it's only about 5%.
But you're talking here about practical policy. I'm wondering about the actual politics of it. I mean, China buying land for its own use.
No, but I'm coming to that. And in fact, as I indicated yesterday, that is an issue which I will touch on. But I want to build up to that in the sense that Asia has experiences that Africa can learn from. On the specific question you've raised about buying African land to assure food security of another country, it's a policy that is not a viable model. It's not a viable model, and it's an issue that has brought together World Bank, African Union, the Food and Agriculture Organization, to try and come up with a policy about land use. And I don't think it is viable for countries to go to another country and buy large tracts of land to produce for their own population.
Have you made that point to the countries involved, and how have they received it?
I have made it publicly and clearly, and also, and it's even not in their interest. Let's suppose you have a poor country with starving population, and a large tract of fertile land is sold to an outsider who produces for export for their own market whilst they starve. How long do you think that model is going to last? And how long will the government that allows that sort of arrangement to remain in power? We only need to look at what happened in Madagascar to understand the dangers in this. Part of the reason the previous government was overthrown was a large sale of land to Korea.
Have you seen any reaction from Korea or China or some of the countries that are thinking it is a viable model? Did they actually take this point on board?
They should. It's in their own interest, and if they don't, they're going to repeat the experience of Madagascar, or future leaders will come and annul the arrangements. And I think they are beginning to think about it.
The broader context of all of this, of course, is one of your favorite themes for more than a decade, and that is Millennium Development Goals, eradication of poverty. We've got 5 more years to the deadline that you set, and a lot of people would say we're nowhere near achieving what you wanted.
We are nowhere near achieving it globally, but tremendous progress has been made. Since the establishment of the Millennium Development Goals, some governments have done extremely well. Millions have been lifted out of poverty. And in fact, the governments that have done well are the ones who factored it into their development plans and took it very seriously. And in fact, I'm telling those governments, once you've achieved the goals, don't stay there, move higher. Education, for example, we demand that every child, particularly girls, should be given at least a primary education. When you attain that level, you move on to secondary education and try to help. But the results is mixed. Some countries will meet the targets and have done very well. Others will not meet all the targets. They may meet a couple of them.
Let me put it in context of something that you said some time ago when you identified the challenges facing the whole planet. And you said global dangers include not just international wars, but also civil violence, organized crime, terrorism, and weapons. But there's poverty, infectious disease, and environmental degradation. Yes. Now, those people, those governments that are really calling the shots, seem to have focused much more on the former set of problems than the latter. Isn't that actually acting against your development goals?
I wouldn't say it's acting against it. If they had acted in another way, in the other way, it would have been much more positive and much more helpful to the attainment of the goals. You are right. We've heard lots of promises. Huge sums have been thrown out, billions. But at the end of the day, the developing countries do not see these promises. I mean, I'm a member of a group they call the Progress Panel, Africa Progress Panel. We are to monitor the promises made by G8 to ensure that they are being met and to encourage African governments to improve governance and fight corruption. When you look at the results and the amounts of money that have been released since Gleneagles, for example, you're nowhere near even half.
Let's be more specific. What about the promise made 1 year ago at L'Aquila?
That's also another, and in fact, it's even a more recent example. And this is where the poorer countries are wondering. The discussions in Copenhagen, where $30 billion were promised for the next couple of years and $100 billion a year by 2020, we're all wondering where the money is going to come from. Unless you have transparent sources of funding, renewable sources of funding, with very clear targets for disbursements, you're not going to convince the countries of the South that they are indeed going to see this money.
Which comes back to the question I posed a moment ago, which is, why is it and what can you do about what seems to be the fact the countries that really can make the difference are busy making promises and failing to deliver?
Yeah, but this is where public opinion is very important, and we've been working with their own civil society to maintain the pressure and to encourage them to do what they've promised to do. A campaign like Make Poverty History, which was organized around the Gleneagles issue, made a difference. It encouraged governments to write off debts some of these countries couldn't pay anyway. And I think we need that sort of movement. We need to push the poverty issue higher up the political agenda again. And of course, the African governments are also working hard trying to improve their own regulatory environment and their governance.
But on this issue, on the Millennium Development Goals, on the issue of Iraq, on the issue of global poverty and education, so many issues that you have spoken long about, and you've always been very diplomatic and measured in your responses. Have you never thought that sometimes you may get more of a action if you banged the drum a little harder, if you made some explicit criticism?
No, I do make criticism, but often to the people concerned and privately, and it gets results. If you get into the shouting marches, sometimes they have bigger megaphones than you have, and it doesn't necessarily get you where you want to go. There are times when you have to raise your voice, and there are times when I have had to, but generally I can get results without shouting.
Let's edge a little bit sideways on this, but with a similar theme. You mentioned Copenhagen. We saw the conference there and the conversations there going nowhere. One of the areas that money keeps being promised, or action keeps being promised but rarely seems to arrive, is the environmental problem. And again, we have the media talking about how the environmental issue is nowhere near as bad as some people like you are trying to make out. How do you deal with this? I
think the science is clear. The science is clear on the threats we face with climate change. We have had people who've denied this process for a long time. The skeptics have always been out there. They are picking on certain mistakes which were made, which have been accepted and recognized by the IPCC, to argue that climate change doesn't exist. It's all in the imagination of some people. I think the case for climate change has been made. Most scientists accept it, and we have to work on that assumption.
Why is it then that the general consensus amongst the ordinary population seems to be that, look, you lied about the Himalayan glaciers, how can we believe you on anything else?
I'm not sure if this is something that the general public is saying or the skeptics are drumming up. Yes, a mistake was made on the Himalaya, admission has been made, and when you're doing this kind of massive research, it is inevitable that some errors would occur.
Let me just ask you about that word mistake, because some people are calling it a lie.
Why would they want to lie about that? Why would they want to lie about that particular issue and not about a whole range of others? Obviously, those skeptics who are making these claims could have come up with other lies and say the whole report was a pack of lies. They have not been able to do that because they can't. And they've run out of arguments. Now they've found an excuse and attacking the IPCC and the scientists.
Does it make you angry that the media seem to focus on that minority of scientists who say no and ignore the majority who say it's clear?
It is unfortunate, but it sells newspapers. It is unfortunate, and some newspapers and media focuses on that. And I hope over time they will come to realize that the skeptics are wrong and that the science is proven and we need to act.
We'll take a short break if we could. Come back and talk a little bit about your role in the UN in the past. You're watching Talk to Al Jazeera with Kofi Annan. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. As Secretary General, you were a key figure in the run-up and the execution of the invasion of Iraq. Recently we've seen Tony Blair giving evidence of the Chilcot inquiry in which he has insisted that everything was done properly and according to best practice and best principle. Now, you have said in the past that the invasion was illegal, contrary to UN Charter. Why is it that we are still debating this? Are these things not clear in international law?
In my mind, it's clear. I think where you sit depends on where you stand.
But the reality is that where we stand right now is a US administration that in its reviews of its own military strategy and its own Pentagon policy now has explicitly committed itself to the idea that it can do what it likes on any basis that it chooses, whereas the UN Charter appears to be fairly clear. Aggressive war is against international law.
Except when it's in self-defense.
Was Iraq in self-defense?
Except when it's in self-defense or to a preemptive action to prevent attack. I think I was very clear on my Iraq situation. The Council indicated, it was the Security Council that said Iraq has to conform or there will be consequences. So in my mind, the need for a second resolution was absolutely clear. If the Council that made that determination had come to the conclusion that Iraq had not performed, the consequences that Iraq was to suffer should have been determined by the Security Council. One cannot go outside the Security Council and take action ostensibly intended to strengthen the Security Council by contravening a Security Council decision.
Since then, we have seen Israel acting in Lebanon. We've seen Israel acting in Gaza. We had President Obama in Oslo accepting a prize for peace in which he said the instruments of war have a role to play in preserving peace. President Obama has clearly committed himself to the principles laid down in the US quadrennial review and their security strategy, which basically says, as I say, that this principle, as far as the US is concerned, is no longer, the UN Charter principles are no longer valid. And we now face a situation in which Iran looks to be the next target. Are you fearful that...
I'm not here to defend US policies. I don't speak for the US. But what is clear is that in accordance with international law and UN practices, you can use force in self-defense. I have made it clear, and I'm on the record, that if one is going to take action to deal with broader threats of security, broader threats to our security, collective security, you cannot do that without going through the Security Council. Any such action, in my mind, will be illegal.
You called for reform of the Security Council a long time ago, and the issue of the permanent veto, the members of the Security Council, is long been a vexed one. Are you seeing any movement in that? Do you think any movement is imminent?
I think ultimately there has to be a reform. The Council as it stands does not reflect the geopolitical realities of today. We need to move with a changing world. You cannot have a council that does not have a country like India on it without a permanent seat. You cannot have a council that doesn't have a single permanent seat for Latin America and no permanent seat for Africa. And Europe has several permanent seats. And when you look at the real situation in the world with the shifts that are taking place, how do you justify that?
Does it worry you that we've now approached a point in political thinking in the Western world that the Nuremberg and everything that we've done since Nuremberg principles don't seem to apply anymore?
But I'm not sure the situation is static. I'm not sure whether in Britain or the US, if one were to be confronted with another Iraq-type situation, that the population and the politicians will not be much more assertive and much more alert. And so I'm not as pessimistic as you are.
Let me put a case to you in which exactly that has happened, and the international community hasn't been assertive at all. The Goldstone report has been roundly ignored and completely dismissed in any context that is relevant to what we're talking about. Now, let me quote to you again what you have said. The right to resist occupation must be understood in its true meaning. It cannot include the right to deliberately kill or maim civilians. What is going on? Well, yeah. Why then is the international community still seeming to accept practices and attitudes that the UN and you seem to say is illegal?
The international community has been very clear on the Goldstone report. I mean, the UN and the body that looked at it asked the two parties, the Israeli government and Hamas, to undertake very serious investigation. And I think they should, because these are very serious charges. And Goldstone is a very honorable man, outstanding jurist whom I know very well. And of course, we have now adopted this habit. If we do not like a report and the report poses a problem, we begin by thrashing the report. We thrash the report, our allies join us in thrashing the report, and nothing gets done. And this is something that we really have to find a way of also resisting the temptation to thrash the report. In my judgment, the Goldstone report was a sound one, and action must be followed. And I think the Council or the General Assembly is going to debate it and are likely to ask again the parties to investigate.
Is it your feeling that President Obama is going the right way around solving the Middle Eastern issue?
I really don't want to comment on President Obama's approach, if he's going the right way or wrong way. He's only been there for a year.
Let me rephrase the question.
Not long ago I was saying we should all help him by reducing our expectations. You know.
Let me rephrase the question. Do you think that there is progress, there can be any progress, in not only the broader Middle Eastern question, but in the question of solving this so-called war against terror, without first solving the Middle Eastern issue?
First of all, let me say that I'm one of those who believes that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not a conflict like any other. There is no other conflict in the world today that has such a charge and has impact on people and groups far away from the theater. If we were to be able to resolve that, it will have very positive impact on the whole region and on other conflicts. I'm not pleased with the progress that is being made, if any progress is being made at all. And I'm not sure that we are going to see the effective action some of us had expected between now and end of the year.
Let me ask you quickly about Kenya, your role in mediating an agreement between President Kibaki and Prime Minister Odinga was widely praised, but we read only this week that a group is now hatching an elaborate plan, I read this from the Kenyan newspapers, at pushing the African Union to end your mandate in Kenya, saying that you've actually been harmful to the process there.
Well, it depends on who is saying that. I think...
of course, these are unnamed sources quoted in a Kenyan newspaper. But nonetheless, do you think, let me read to you a little bit more, he is taking it too far, almost micromanaging Kenya. Odinga thinks he is our headmaster. Are these merited?
I think it's an overreaction from certain quarters. I have not micromanaged Kenya. I don't have the capacity nor the inclination.
But the conflict now appears to be rising again. Do you think it's going to erupt?
No, I think the coalition will stick. I think they have made quite a lot of progress on reform. And if the parties work together, I do expect Kenya in the course of this year to have a new constitution, a new electoral law, and a new land law. So a lot is happening. There are tensions within the coalition, between the partners and within the parties. So you do have tension. And I think this issue came up because of the recent tension between the Prime Minister and the President. And the Prime Minister called on me to intervene, and come and settle their differences. And I didn't go to Kenya to do that. I did issue a statement appealing to them to resolve it themselves because I was confident they can do it. But because he did that, the other side is saying, we don't need a headmaster. We should be able to resolve our issue. Don't forget, I was a colonial subject myself. I don't want to be a colonial governor in Kenya.
And there we will have to leave it. Thank you very much indeed for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you very much.